Before a human being could be placed into orbit, the Soviet space program faced a problem that could not be solved by engineering alone. The machines were ready. The rockets could lift payloads beyond the atmosphere. The guidance systems functioned with increasing reliability. But one critical variable remained unknown. No one knew whether a living organism could survive spaceflight. Weightlessness had never been experienced by any human. The physiological effects were speculative. Medical theory offered hypotheses, not answers. Would the heart continue to function normally? Would breathing remain stable? Would consciousness be maintained under prolonged acceleration and isolation? These were not academic questions. A single failure involving a human life would be impossible to conceal and politically devastating. The Soviet system, built on control and secrecy, could not afford such an outcome. The risk had to be transferred elsewhere. That transfer took the form of animal missions. Animals had been used in aviation experiments before, but space presented conditions that were fundamentally different. Extreme acceleration, prolonged confinement, complete isolation, and an environment where even basic bodily functions were uncertain. Sending animals was not a gesture of cruelty or indifference. It was a calculated decision shaped by fear, urgency, and the absence of alternatives. The logic was simple. If an animal could survive launch, orbit, and return, then a human might follow. If it could not, the failure would remain contained. This logic carried moral weight, even if it was rarely discussed. Early Soviet animal missions were inconsistent and often tragic. Some flights ended prematurely, others failed during re-entry. Several animals did not survive. These losses were not publicly acknowledged at the time, but they informed every subsequent decision. By the end of the 1950s, the Soviet space program had accumulated enough data to understand one thing clearly: survival in space was possible, but not guaranteed. Each mission reduced uncertainty, but never eliminated it. The challenge was not simply to keep an organism alive, but to observe how it responded under stress. Heart rate, respiration, reflexes, and behavior had to be monitored remotely. The animal was not a passenger. It was a biological instrument operating under extreme conditions. Designing such missions required a delicate balance. The spacecraft had to provide oxygen, temperature control, nutrition, and waste management, all within a volume barely large enough to move. Automation was essential. Manual intervention was impossible. Once launched, the mission would unfold without the possibility of correction. This placed enormous responsibility on preparation. By the time planners began designing a new orbital mission in 1960, they understood that the margin for error was narrow. The next flight would not be experimental in isolation. It would directly inform the decision to send a human being into orbit. That made the choice of animals critical. The mission required subjects that could tolerate confinement, adapt to training, and survive stress without panic. Emotional stability mattered as much as physical health. The animals would be placed in conditions they could not comprehend, with no ability to understand cause or purpose. They would be sent where survival was never guaranteed. This mission would later become known for its outcome: success, return, and survival. But at the planning stage, none of that was certain. The planners did not know which path history would take. They only knew that without this step, the next one would be impossible. Belka and Strelka were selected not because they were special. They were selected because they could endure. Their mission was not designed to make history. It was designed to answer a question, and the answer would shape everything that followed. The selection of animals for spaceflight was not guided by sentiment. It was governed by practicality. By the time planners began preparing the orbital mission that would later carry Belka and Strelka, The Soviet space program already had experience with animal flights. That experience had led to clear, if uncomfortable, conclusions. Not every animal was suitable. In fact, most were not. The mission demanded subjects that could endure conditions far removed from anything found on Earth. The first criterion was size. The spacecraft was extremely small. Every additional kilogram increased launch risk. Large animals were immediately excluded. The candidates had to be light, compact, and physically resilient. The second criterion was physiology. Heart rate, respiratory stability, and tolerance to acceleration were critical. Animals prone to panic, irregular breathing, or sudden spikes in heart activity were eliminated early. There was no room for unpredictability. The third criterion was behavior. This proved to be one of the most important factors. Spaceflight required prolonged confinement in a rigid harness. Movement was limited. Sensory input was reduced. The animal had to remain calm in silence, darkness, and isolation. Aggressive or overly excitable behavior was unacceptable. For this reason, the program did not use purebred dogs. Instead, it relied almost exclusively on mixed-breed strays. This decision was deliberate. Stray dogs were considered more adaptable. They had survived harsh environments, irregular feeding, and constant stress. They were accustomed to uncertainty. In the eyes of the program's medical and engineering staff, this made them more resilient than animals raised in controlled conditions. There was also a practical dimension. Strays had no owners. This reduced emotional and political complications. The animals were easier to recruit, easier to replace, and less likely to attract public attention. Their anonymity aligned with the secrecy of the program. The selection process itself was clinical. Dogs were examined, measured, observed, and documented. Their responses to noise, restraint, and unfamiliar environments were recorded. Those that showed excessive fear or resistance were removed. Those that adapted quickly were retained. Over time, the pool narrowed. Only a small number of candidates progressed to advanced training. From this group, even fewer would be selected for actual flight. The rest would remain as backups or be used in ground testing. Belka and Strelka emerged from this process not because they were exceptional, but because they met the system's requirements. They were small, calm, and responsive. They tolerated confinement. They adapted to routine. They showed no signs of panic under stress. In a program that valued predictability above all else, these traits mattered more than anything else. Names at this stage were secondary. The animals were primarily identified by numbers and test records. Personalization came later, after success. During preparation, individuality was minimized. This was intentional. Emotional distance helped maintain focus on outcomes rather than subjects. The ethical dimension of this process was rarely discussed openly. The mission planners did not frame their work as sacrifice or heroism. They framed it as necessity. The language used in reports was technical, impersonal, and precise. The animals were treated as biological systems operating under controlled stress. Yet the reality was unavoidable. These dogs did not choose their role. They were placed into a process designed to expose them to extreme risk in order to reduce uncertainty for those who would follow. Their value lay not in survival alone, but in the data their bodies would generate under conditions no human had yet experienced. This understanding shaped every aspect of preparation. Once selected, the dogs entered a training regime that would fundamentally alter their daily existence. Their environment became artificial. Their routines became rigid. Every variable was controlled, measured, and adjusted. The selection phase was complete. What followed was transformation. The next step was not about choosing animals, it was about reshaping them for the unknown. Once selected, the dogs were removed from anything resembling a normal environment. Training for spaceflight was not an extension of natural behavior. It was a process of adaptation to conditions that had never existed before. The goal was not to teach the animals to understand space. It was to condition them to tolerate it. The first challenge was confinement. The spacecraft capsule allowed almost no freedom of movement. Dogs were placed into narrow containers designed to simulate the dimensions of the flight module. Over time, the duration of confinement increased. Minutes became hours. Hours became days. Any signs of distress were carefully recorded. Resistance was expected. Some animals reacted with agitation or refused to eat. Others showed elevated heart rates or irregular breathing. These reactions were not punished, but they were noted. Animals that failed to adapt were gradually removed from the program. Belka and Strelka adapted. This adaptation did not mean comfort, it meant acceptance. The next phase introduced physical stress. Centrifuge training exposed the dogs to extreme acceleration, simulating the forces experienced during launch and re-entry. These forces compressed the body, restricted breathing, and disrupted balance. Medical instruments monitored cardiovascular response in real time. The data mattered more than the experience. Engineers and physicians studied how acceleration affected blood pressure, respiration, and muscle control. They were looking for thresholds, points at which function degraded or failed entirely. The goal was to understand how much stress a living organism could endure without irreversible harm. Noise and vibration followed. Launch was not a smooth process. It involved intense sound pressure, constant vibration, and sudden mechanical shocks. To replicate these conditions, the dogs were placed in vibrating platforms and exposed to recorded launch noise at increasing volumes. These sessions were disorienting. The animals could not understand the source of the stimuli. They could only respond. Training aimed to reduce panic responses and encourage passive endurance. Calm behavior was reinforced through repetition and routine. Feeding posed another challenge. In space, normal eating was impossible. Food had to be delivered in controlled portions, often in semi-liquid form. Dogs were trained to consume nutrition through specialized dispensers while restrained. Waste management was equally controlled, requiring the animals to adapt to unnatural bodily routines. Every aspect of biological function was regulated. Training schedules were rigid. The environment was sterile. Interaction with handlers was limited and deliberate. Familiarity was discouraged. Emotional attachment was considered a liability. This was not neglect, it was a method. The program sought to minimize variables. Emotional dependence could alter behavior under stress. Predictability was essential. Medical observation continued throughout. Electrodes tracked heart activity. Sensors monitored breathing and temperature. Behavioral responses were cataloged. Over time, patterns emerged. Some animals showed increasing tolerance, others plateaued or declined. Belka and Strelka remained stable. Their responses were consistent. Their recovery after stress was reliable. They did not exhibit escalating anxiety. In a program defined by uncertainty, this consistency was critical. Still, training could not eliminate the unknown. Weightlessness could not be fully simulated. Isolation in orbit could only be approximated. No test could replicate the complete experience of spaceflight. At best, training reduced risk. It did not remove it. This limitation was understood. The purpose of training was not to guarantee success. It was to prepare for observation. By the end of the training phase, Belka and Strelka were no longer ordinary animals. Their daily existence had been transformed into a controlled experiment. Their behavior under stress had become predictable enough to justify the next step. That step was irreversible. Once the mission moved from training to integration, there would be no further selection, no replacements, no second attempts. The dogs were now part of a spacecraft system. They were not being prepared to fly. They were being prepared to test the limits of life beyond Earth. Designing a space mission for living beings required a different mindset than designing one for machines. A satellite could fail silently. A biological organism could not. By the time Belka and Strelka were selected, engineers understood that survival would depend not on a single system, but on the interaction of many. Life support, temperature control, oxygen supply, waste management, and communication all had to function simultaneously, without manual intervention. There would be no pilot input. The capsule designed for the mission was extremely small. Its dimensions were dictated by mass constraints and launch capabilities. Every additional component increased complexity and risk. Engineers were forced to make difficult trade-offs between redundancy and simplicity. Life support systems were central. Oxygen had to be supplied at a steady rate. Carbon dioxide had to be removed continuously. Temperature had to remain within a narrow range despite external extremes. Failure in any one of these areas would quickly become fatal. These systems were automated. Once the capsule left the launch pad, there would be no possibility of repair. Ground control could monitor telemetry, but intervention was limited. The spacecraft had to function as a closed, self-regulating environment. Feeding and hydration posed unique challenges. In microgravity, normal eating behavior was impossible. Food had to be delivered in measured portions, designed to be consumed while the animals remained restrained. The formulation had to be nutritionally complete, easily digestible, and safe under varying pressure conditions. Waste management was equally critical. Excretion in a sealed environment created risks of contamination and system failure. Specialized containment mechanisms were developed to isolate waste without causing discomfort or distress that might affect behavior and physiological readings. Monitoring systems were integrated throughout the capsule. Sensors tracked heart rate, respiration, body temperature, and movement. Cameras provided visual observation. These instruments were not added for curiosity. They were essential. The mission's value depended on the quality and continuity of the data collected. Engineers designed the capsule with the expectation of failure. This was not pessimism, it was realism. Multiple failure scenarios were considered: loss of pressure, temperature fluctuations, electrical faults, guidance errors, and re-entry instability. Emergency protocols were limited. In many cases, failure would simply mean loss of the mission. Re-entry was considered the most dangerous phase. During descent, the capsule would experience extreme heat and mechanical stress. Parachute deployment had to occur at precisely the right moment. A delay of seconds could prove fatal. Redundancy was built where possible, but weight constraints limited options. The dogs themselves were secured in harnesses designed to prevent injury during high acceleration and deceleration. These restraints restricted movement almost completely. Comfort was secondary to survival. Throughout the design process, uncertainty remained. No amount of testing could fully replicate orbital conditions. Vacuum chambers, thermal simulations, and vibration tests provided approximations, not certainty. Engineers accepted that some risks would remain unquantifiable until the mission itself. This acceptance shaped decision-making. Rather than attempting to eliminate all danger, the program focused on managing it. Systems were simplified. Failure points were reduced where possible. The design favored reliability over innovation. By the time the capsule was finalized, it represented the cumulative outcome of compromise. It was not elegant, it was not flexible, but it was functional. Belka and Strelka were integrated into the spacecraft not as passengers, but as components within a larger system. Their presence transformed the capsule from a machine into an experiment involving life under extreme conditions. At this stage, the mission ceased to be theoretical. Hardware was assembled, systems were sealed, testing transitioned from simulation to rehearsal. The window for revision narrowed rapidly. From this point forward, success or failure would be determined not by design choices alone, but by execution. The next step would move the mission beyond preparation. It would move it to the launch pad. Launch day did not begin with ceremony. It began with routine. By the time Belka and Strelka were transported to the launch site, the mission had already passed its final point of no return. The spacecraft was sealed, systems were integrated, the flight profile had been approved. From that moment forward, there were no decisions left to make, only procedures to follow. The dogs were placed into the capsule hours before liftoff. Their harnesses were secured, sensors were connected, life support systems were activated. From this point on, the animals would be monitored continuously, but they would not be handled again. Human contact ended before the mission began. The launch site itself was quiet. This was not unusual. Most space launches in the Soviet program were conducted under conditions of strict secrecy. There were no crowds, no announcements, no visible acknowledgement that a historic event was about to occur. Only a limited group of engineers and technicians were present. Each followed a checklist refined through years of launches and failures. Fueling proceeded slowly and deliberately. Temperature readings were checked. Electrical systems were verified. Telemetry links were tested repeatedly. The dogs remained restrained throughout. They could not see the rocket. They could not hear instructions. Their awareness was limited to vibration, sound, and the confined interior of the capsule. There was no way to calm them or explain what was about to happen. At ignition, the environment changed instantly. Acceleration forces pressed the animals into their harnesses. Vibration intensified. Noise levels exceeded anything experienced during training. For several seconds, telemetry was the only indication that systems were functioning normally. This was the most dangerous phase of the mission. A failure at launch would leave no margin for recovery. Escape systems were limited. Survival was unlikely. Engineers monitored data streams with heightened focus, watching for any deviation from expected parameters. As the rocket climbed, acceleration increased. Heart rate and respiration data showed stress responses, but remained within acceptable limits. The dogs were alive. The systems were functioning. The rocket continued its ascent. Separation stages passed one by one. Each event carried risk. Each success reduced uncertainty slightly. By the time the spacecraft reached orbital velocity, the most immediate threats had been avoided. Weightlessness followed. For the first time, Belka and Strelka experienced a condition that could not be replicated on Earth. Restraints prevented uncontrolled movement, but internal sensory cues changed dramatically. Balance signals disappeared. Bodily orientation lost meaning. Telemetry showed altered physiological responses. These changes were expected. What mattered was stability. The data indicated that core functions remained intact. Breathing continued, heart rhythms stabilized, the capsule had entered orbit. The launch phase was complete. From the ground, confirmation came quietly. There were no public statements, no immediate recognition. Internally, the mission transitioned from ascent to observation. The dogs were now circling Earth at high speed, beyond the reach of direct intervention. At this stage, success could not yet be claimed. Orbit did not guarantee survival. Systems still had to function for the duration of the mission. Biological responses under prolonged weightlessness remained uncertain. The most critical data had yet to be collected. The launch had answered one question. It had not answered the most important one. That answer would come only with time. Once the spacecraft reached orbit, the mission entered its most uncertain phase. Launch had been violent and brief. Orbit was quiet and prolonged. For the first time, the dogs were no longer reacting to immediate mechanical stress. Instead, their bodies had to adapt to an environment that had never existed in their evolutionary history. Weightlessness altered everything. On Earth, balance is maintained through a constant interaction between gravity, vision, and inner ear signals. In orbit, that system collapsed. There was no up or down, no stable reference point. Even restrained within the capsule, the dogs experienced sensory disruption that could not be fully predicted. Engineers expected confusion. What they did not know was how long it would last, or whether it would escalate. Telemetry streams became the primary source of information. Heart rate, respiration, body temperature, and movement were tracked continuously. Cameras inside the capsule provided visual confirmation, but interpretation was limited. Behavior could be observed but not explained. In the first hours of orbit, physiological responses fluctuated. Heart rates increased intermittently. Breathing patterns changed. These reactions were consistent with stress and disorientation. The critical question was whether they would stabilize or deteriorate. Stabilization was not guaranteed. Previous animal missions had shown that weightlessness could trigger nausea, loss of coordination, and in some cases, severe distress. In a confined environment, such reactions could compromise life support systems or interfere with monitoring equipment. Belka and Strelka were observed closely. Their movements were limited by restraints, but small behavioral changes were visible. Muscle tension varied, head positioning shifted, periods of rest alternated with alertness. These patterns were logged and compared against baseline data collected during training. Gradually, indicators began to normalize. Heart rates returned closer to expected ranges. Respiration stabilized. Body temperature remained within acceptable limits. These changes suggested adaptation rather than collapse. This was a critical outcome. It indicated that a mammalian organism could tolerate prolonged exposure to microgravity without immediate failure. The significance of this observation extended far beyond the mission itself. However, not all data was reassuring. At one point during the mission, telemetry showed irregular activity associated with one of the dogs. The data suggested heightened stress responses and abnormal behavior. On the ground, this caused concern. Engineers debated possible causes. Was the animal experiencing severe disorientation? Was there a malfunction in monitoring equipment? Was the response temporary or the beginning of systemic failure? There was no way to intervene. This was one of the defining features of orbital observation. Once in space, the mission unfolded autonomously. Ground control could observe, but not correct. Decisions had already been made. Outcomes were now a matter of consequence. The period of uncertainty passed. The irregular readings subsided. Physiological parameters returned to acceptable ranges. The episode did not repeat. While the exact cause remained unclear, the overall conclusion was cautiously optimistic. The dogs were surviving. Beyond survival, the mission yielded another crucial insight. Weightlessness did not immediately incapacitate the animals. Cognitive function appeared intact. There were no signs of loss of consciousness or extreme panic. This suggested that a human pilot might remain functional in orbit, a prerequisite for any manned mission. The duration of orbit mattered. Short exposures could be misleading. Long-term effects were unknown. The mission was designed to observe sustained response over time, not just initial reaction. Each additional orbit increased confidence, but also prolonged exposure to risk. Life support systems continued to operate as designed. Oxygen levels remained stable. Carbon dioxide removal was effective. Temperature control held within limits. Waste containment systems functioned without contamination. These systems were now being tested under real conditions, not simulation. The spacecraft itself became a living laboratory. Every reading contributed to a growing body of evidence. Data that could not be generated on Earth was now streaming back in real time. The value of the mission was accumulating with each minute spent in orbit. At the same time, tension remained. Re-entry had not yet occurred. Statistically, it remained the most dangerous phase. Many earlier missions had failed during descent. Heat, structural stress, and timing errors could still negate everything achieved so far. For the engineers monitoring the mission, orbit was a suspended state. Not success, not failure, only continuation. Belka and Strelka continued to circle the Earth, unseen by the public, unknown to the world, carrying the burden of proof for a question humanity had never answered before. Could life endure beyond the planet that created it? The data suggested that the answer was not no. But confirmation required one final step. Survival in space meant little if return was impossible. The mission would not be judged by orbit alone. It would be judged by what happened next. Re-entry was never treated as a routine procedure. In many respects, it was considered more dangerous than launch. By the time the spacecraft carrying Belka and Strelka prepared to leave orbit, the mission had already exceeded its primary objectives. Data had been collected, biological responses had been observed, survival in weightlessness had been demonstrated. Yet none of this would matter if the final phase failed. Descent through Earth's atmosphere imposed stresses unlike any other. As the spacecraft slowed from orbital velocity, friction generated extreme heat. Structural integrity depended on precise angles, timing, and material performance. A slight deviation could result in loss of control or catastrophic failure. The descent sequence was automated. Once initiated, it could not be interrupted. Ground control monitored telemetry, but intervention was impossible. The spacecraft would either follow its programmed trajectory or it would not. Inside the capsule, the environment changed rapidly. Acceleration forces returned abruptly, pressing the dogs back into their harnesses. After a period of weightlessness, this sudden reintroduction of gravity placed additional strain on the cardiovascular system. Heart rate and respiration were monitored closely as readings fluctuated under stress. This phase was unforgiving. If parachute deployment failed, impact would be fatal. If thermal protection failed, the capsule would not survive. If guidance systems malfunctioned, recovery would be impossible. As the spacecraft descended, communication became intermittent. This was expected. Plasma formation during re-entry often disrupted radio signals. For several critical minutes, ground controllers received no data. During this blackout, the mission's outcome remained unknown. Silence followed. In earlier missions, this silence had sometimes been permanent. When telemetry resumed, it did not immediately confirm success. Systems reported partial data. Recovery teams waited for visual confirmation. Tracking coordinates narrowed, but certainty remained elusive. The parachute phase was decisive. Deployment occurred within a narrow window. Sensors indicated separation and deceleration. This suggested that the capsule had survived the most violent portion of descent. However, Survival still depended on landing conditions. The final descent was uncontrolled. The capsule descended toward Earth without the ability to maneuver. Wind, terrain, and timing would determine the nature of impact. Recovery teams were dispatched to the predicted landing zone, operating under limited information. Confirmation came not from instruments, but from observation. The capsule was located intact. Upon recovery, technicians approached cautiously. Internal pressure was assessed. Life support status was checked. Only after these steps were completed was the capsule opened. Belka and Strelka were alive. This outcome was not celebrated immediately. First, medical evaluation took priority. The dogs were removed carefully, still monitored for signs of distress or delayed complications. Vital signs were recorded. Behavioral responses were observed. Recovery from re-entry stress was gradual but stable. The mission had succeeded. From a technical perspective, the return validated the entire concept of orbital life support and recovery. From a biological perspective, it demonstrated that a mammalian organism could survive launch, sustained orbit, and re-entry as a continuous sequence. This was the final confirmation required. The question that had defined years of preparation now had an answer. A living being could go to space and come back. The implications were immediate. Medical teams began analyzing post-flight data. Comparisons were made between pre-flight, in-flight, and post-flight readings. Short-term effects were documented. Recovery timelines were assessed. No critical failures were identified. The data was sufficient. The barrier that had separated theory from action had been removed. For the Soviet space program, this moment marked a turning point. The uncertainty that had justified animal missions was reduced enough to permit the next step. Human spaceflight was no longer speculative, it was actionable. Belka and Strelka did not know this. They experienced only the physical consequences of a mission designed without their understanding or consent. Yet their survival transformed the future of the program in a way no simulation could have achieved. The return did not conclude the mission. It redefined what was possible. What remained was to understand what this mission had enabled, and to acknowledge the role played by those who bore its risks. That reckoning belongs to the final chapter. The mission of Belka and Strelka did not end with their return to Earth. Its true consequences unfolded afterward. In the immediate aftermath, the focus remained clinical. Medical teams analyzed physiological data collected before, during, and after the flight. Recovery patterns were compared against existing models. Particular attention was paid to cardiovascular stability, neurological response, and behavioral changes. The results were decisive. The dogs had endured launch, sustained orbital flight, and re-entry without irreversible harm. Short-term stress responses were observed, but they resolved predictably. No critical failures emerged. From a medical standpoint, the mission had answered its central question. A living organism could survive spaceflight as a complete cycle. This conclusion reshaped planning within the Soviet space program. What had previously been theoretical became operational. Safety margins could now be calculated using real biological data rather than speculation. Training protocols were adjusted. Life support systems were validated under real conditions. Most importantly, the justification for delaying human flight disappeared. Within months, preparations for the first manned orbital mission accelerated. Selection criteria were refined, medical thresholds were updated, confidence replaced uncertainty, not optimism, but informed readiness. When Yuri Gagarin later entered orbit, he did so under conditions shaped directly by the data Belka and Strelka had provided. Their mission did not guarantee success, but it reduced unknowns to a level the system was willing to accept. In this sense, their flight was not a precursor, it was a prerequisite. After the mission, Belka and Strelka were no longer anonymous test subjects. They became symbols presented to the public as proof of success. Their survival allowed the program to frame the mission as a triumph rather than a risk narrowly avoided. They lived out their lives under human care. They were observed, photographed, and occasionally displayed. One of Strelka's offspring was later given as a diplomatic gesture, a reminder that the mission had ended not in loss, but continuity. Their existence became part of a controlled narrative of progress. Yet the deeper meaning of their role lay elsewhere. Belka and Strelka did not choose to participate. They did not understand the purpose of their mission. They bore risk without agency. This is not a condemnation of the people who designed the mission. It is an acknowledgement of reality. Space exploration, in its earliest stages, required decisions made under profound uncertainty. The risks of human flight were transferred to animals because the system demanded results without catastrophic consequence. Their mission represents a boundary. It marks the point at which exploration crossed from mechanical experimentation into biological risk. It forced planners to confront the ethical cost of progress, even if that cost was rarely discussed publicly. The dogs survived, but survival alone does not diminish the weight of what was asked of them. They were confined, restrained, and exposed to conditions no organism had experienced before. They endured stress without comprehension. Their value was measured in data points and telemetry streams. And yet, because of that endurance, the course of human history changed. The first human spaceflight did not begin with a rocket on the launch pad. It began with a decision to test the unknown on those who could not refuse. Belka and Strelka stand at that threshold, not as heroes in a conventional sense, but as participants in a process that reshaped the limits of possibility. Their legacy is not found in celebration, it is found in consequence. They proved that life could leave Earth and return. They reduced uncertainty where theory failed. They made the next step possible. That is the measure of their contribution. And that is why their mission endures as one of the quiet foundations of human spaceflight.